August 27, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 800 miles east of Guadalcanal. The steel deck of the USS West Point burned under the midday sun as the transport ship carved through blue water, carrying its cargo toward San Francisco. Not ammunition, not supplies, human cargo. 300 Japanese prisoners of war, captured in the jungles of Guadalcanal, crammed into the ship's belly. They sat in silence, waiting for death. Their officers had told them capture meant torture, worse than any battlefield wound. That Americans would burn them alive, slit their throats, dishonor their families for generations. So when the steel hatches slammed shut and boots echoed overhead, most prisoners closed their eyes and prepared for the end. Then came a sound that made no sense. A hiss, a trickle, the clatter of metal on metal. The scent of hot rice filled the air. American guards appeared at the hatch, carrying not whips, not chains, but ladles and trays, steaming food. Hot coffee in tin mugs, real meat, fresh vegetables. The prisoners stared in disbelief. When the first man bit into the food, trembling, eyes darting, nothing happened except that he ate, and ate, until tears ran down his cheeks. In that moment, something profound began. These men had been told Americans were demons, but demons did not feed their captives better than the Imperial Army had fed its own soldiers. Before we dive deeper into this remarkable story, if you're enjoying this content, hit that like button and subscribe to stay updated with more untold stories from World War II. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything to this channel. By the time the ship reached San Francisco, whispers had already spread through the cargo hold. They don't starve us. They give us blankets. They treat us like soldiers. For men raised under the code of Bushido, where surrender meant eternal shame and capture equaled death, this kindness was more disorienting than any interrogation. The propaganda had been clear. Americans were barbaric. They had no honor, no culture, no mercy. Yet here were prisoners gaining weight while their comrades back home starved on half rations of moldy rice. The contradiction was impossible to reconcile. The journey continued by rail. Trains carried the prisoners eastward across a landscape they had never imagined. Cities untouched by war, factories churning smoke, cars filling streets, farmland stretching endlessly under open sky. One prisoner, Private Kenji Nakamura, pressed his face to the window and felt his worldview crack. Japan had promised its people that America was weak, desperate, collapsing under the weight of a war it could not win. But the country rolling past showed no signs of suffering, only abundance. When the trains finally stopped, the prisoners found themselves in places with strange names: Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, camps scattered across Colorado and Texas. Each compound was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Yes, but inside, the reality defied everything they had been taught to expect. The first night at Camp McCoy, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka lay awake on his cot, certain the kindness was a trap. He listened for boots, for the rattle of rifle bolts, for the moment when punishment would begin. Instead, he heard music, a radio playing softly from the guard station. A woman's voice, smooth and warm, singing about love and home. Not a war march, not propaganda, just music. For the first time in months, Tanaka closed his eyes without clutching his stomach in hunger. The enemy had sung him to sleep. Camp McCoy became the largest Japanese POW facility in the continental United States, holding 2,700 prisoners at its peak. It also housed German and Italian POWs, but the Japanese were kept separate, isolated not by cruelty, but by the simple logistics of language and culture. The camp operated under the 1929 Geneva Convention, which mandated that prisoners receive the same food rations as the captor nation's own soldiers. For the Americans, this was policy. For the Japanese, it was salvation. The first morning whistle brought Tanaka and the others to the mess hall. The smell hit them like a physical force. Eggs, bread, butter melting across toast, coffee steaming in thick mugs, plates clattered, trays slid down metal counters. Some prisoners refused at first, believing the food was poisoned. They watched American guards eat from the same kitchens, drink the same coffee, chew the same bread. Slowly, suspicion gave way to appetite. Within a week, men who had fought at Bloody Ridge and the Tanaru River were eating 3 meals a day. Their uniforms no longer hung loose. Their faces filled out. Their bodies began to remember what it felt like not to be starving. The camp routine was rigid but never brutal. Roll call at dawn, work details after breakfast, lunch at noon. Afternoons spent clearing brush, tending gardens, repairing fences. The prisoners worked, but they were not beaten. They labored, but they were not starved. Guards watched, but rarely shouted. The rhythm was steady, almost peaceful, and for men who had expected chains and whips, this normalcy was profoundly unsettling. Then came Sunday. Church bells rang in the distance, carried on the wind. A line of prisoners gathered near the gate, curious. Across the fields, white wooden buildings stood, steeples rising toward the sky. Townspeople filed in with hymn books. Children in clean clothes skipped up the steps. The guards explained through interpreters. Those who wished could attend service, listen to music, pray if they wanted. No punishment either way. The concept was alien. In the Imperial Army, religion was duty. Here, it was choice. Tanaka went, half in defiance, half in curiosity. Inside, he watched Americans bow their heads, not to an emperor, but to a god. Then the organ began to play. The sound filled the walls, vibrating through the wooden pews, washing over him like a wave. It was the first music he had heard since boyhood that did not sound like war. Some prisoners wept. They were not sure why. Perhaps because the melody did not speak of victory or defeat, but of something simpler, something human. As weeks became months, the layers of fear began to peel away. A guard passing out cigarettes without mockery. A farmer thanking a prisoner for fixing his fence. Children pointing through the wire. Curious, but never hateful. At night, the camp glowed with a different kind of revelation. Projectors whirred. Screens lit up. Suddenly, men who had never seen a moving picture watched shadows dance into life. Cowboy films, comedies. American soldiers laughing at the same jokes as the prisoners watching beside them. Private Yamashita whispered to Tanaka one evening, "Do you think they show us these films to mock us?" Tanaka shook his head. "No, they are showing us who they are, and who they were was not the demon image drawn in Japanese propaganda. These were people who worked, ate, prayed, and laughed. People who, inexplicably, treated prisoners with a dignity they had rarely afforded each other in battle." Letters began to arrive from home. At first, most prisoners hesitated to write back, ashamed to confess survival. But when the first replies came, mothers relieved their sons were alive, wives writing of children born during the war. The shame cracked. Families did not despise them for being captured. They were grateful. The prisoners realized something profound. Their enemy had not broken them with brutality. The Americans had dismantled their fear with generosity. By the spring of 1943, life inside the wire had taken on rhythms that felt almost normal. The barbed wire fence no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a border between two worlds. And life on the inside was safer, fuller, and stranger than anything the prisoners had imagined. The gates opened one morning for work detail. Prisoners filed onto trucks, hands folded, uncertain. They were being sent to help with the harvest. Tanaka sat stiffly in the back, staring at the passing fields. Corn stretched in tall green rows. Soybeans swayed in the breeze. The air smelled of earth, not smoke. Birds sang without fear. When the truck stopped, American farmers waited with hats pulled low. Their wives stood back with baskets. The guards stepped aside. Prisoners climbed down, unsure of how to move in this new landscape. The farmers did not shout. They handed out tools. Hoes, baskets, gloves. One farmer even pointed with a smile, as if instructing a hired hand. And then it began. Rows of men in worn uniforms working shoulder to shoulder with American soil under their boots. The sun was heavy, the labor real, but food and water were plentiful. At midday the women brought out sandwiches, apples, pitchers of lemonade that glistened with condensation. The guards ate. Then, after a pause, they gestured for the prisoners to eat, too. Tanaka hesitated. The thought of taking food directly from an American family was unbearable, not from fear of poison anymore, but from shame. Then a farmer's daughter, no older than 10, approached. She held out an apple with small hands, smiling shyly. Tanaka bowed awkwardly and accepted. The girl giggled at the formality, running back to her mother. Something inside him broke. By evening the prisoners were exhausted but astonished. They had expected suspicion, hatred. Instead, they found themselves treated almost as laborers on contract. When the trucks rolled back into camp, the men spoke in hushed tones. "They do not look at us like beasts," one said. Another murmured, "If our people saw this, they would not believe it." Over the weeks, the routine became natural. Trucks left at dawn, returned at dusk. In fields, barns, and orchards, the lines between captor and captive blurred. Farmers spoke slowly, teaching English words. Corn, wheat, apple, good job. Prisoners taught them Japanese in return. Laughter replaced suspicion. Letters from home began to echo a grim theme. Cities bombed, food scarce, fear constant. Families wrote of ration cards, blackouts, children crying from hunger. Yet here the prisoners ate full meals, drank coffee, gained weight. The irony burned. Some felt guilt, others felt relief. For most, the shame of capture began to dissolve into gratitude that at least they lived. The guards noticed something remarkable. Discipline became easier, not harder. Prisoners worked willingly, sometimes even volunteering for extra shifts. Escape attempts grew rare. Why run into a country where even civilians treated them better than their own officers once had? There were moments when the strangeness cut deep. One autumn afternoon, Tanaka overheard two farmers talking. They spoke casually, like men trading gossip. One said his boy was stationed on Saipan. Another spoke of letters from New Guinea, the words pierced like a bayonet. The sons of these kind farmers might be the same men Tanaka's comrades had killed, or who had killed his friends. Yet when the day ended, the same men slapped him on the back, handing him an extra sandwich for the ride home. How could an enemy live in two forms at once? Ruthless on the battlefield, generous at the dinner table? In the camp itself, transformations multiplied. Baseball diamonds were carved into open fields. At first, the game made no sense. A bat, a ball, bases that seemed arbitrary. But guards explained, demonstrated. Prisoners mimicked the movements, then grew competitive. By the second summer of 1944, Japanese teams played Americans in full games. Laughter echoed across the wire as if war existed only in memory. Evenings became cultural exchanges. A prisoner who had once been a music teacher found a violin. Another carved shamisen-like instruments from scrap wood. Guards brought harmonicas. Songs mingled. Japanese folk melodies blending with American country tunes. For the first time, the prisoners discovered what it felt like not to be feared, not to be hated, but to be part of something shared. But perhaps the greatest shift came with the newspapers. American guards sometimes left papers in the mess hall. At first, the Japanese avoided them. Then curiosity won. They read of Allied advances, island after island falling, cities in flames back home. Yet alongside the grim news were stories of ordinary life, baseball stars, elections, crime in small towns. A world not consumed by hatred but driven by routine. Tanaka found himself staring at photographs of smiling families in Chicago, advertisements for new refrigerators, pictures of school children. It was impossible to reconcile with the propaganda vision of Americans as savages without culture or honor. Here on the printed page was proof of something entirely different, a society vibrant, prosperous, and strangely free. The prisoners began to talk openly, not of escape, but of what life might be after the war. Could they return home and tell their families what they had seen? Would anyone believe them? Would they even be allowed to speak? One night, as snow began to fall, Tanaka sat near the barrack stove with Yamashita. "Do you fear them still?" Tanaka asked. Yamashita shook his head slowly. "On the battlefield?" "Yes, but here, no. How can I fear a man who hands me bread when I am hungry?" Silence hung in the air. They both knew the truth. The Americans had destroyed their fear, not with guns, but with kindness that demanded nothing in return. By late 1944, the camps no longer felt like cages. They were strange, yes, filled with longing for home, but they were not places of terror. Many prisoners began to dread not captivity, but the day it would end. The day they would have to return to a homeland where food was scarce, families shattered, and the future uncertain. The winter of 1944 pressed hard against the fences. Snow fell thick, muffling the world beyond the wire. But inside the barracks the stove glowed red, and the air was heavy with steam from cooking pots. For men who had expected starvation, captivity had become a paradox. They were eating more, weighing more, even laughing more than at any time since leaving home. Tanaka woke one morning to the sound of boots crunching on ice. Guards bringing in the day's deliveries. The food crates opened. Flour, sugar, tins of fruit, even coffee beans. He stared at the abundance and felt a pang of disbelief. He remembered his mother's last letter before capture, written in a trembling hand. She had described lines stretching for hours outside rice shops, rations barely enough to keep the family alive. And here, in the land of the enemy, food was measured not in ounces but in excess. At dinner, Yamashita whispered that he had gained 20 pounds in captivity, and the men laughed, uneasy with the truth that they were thriving while Japan starved. Newspapers left by guards showed American advances Leyte, the Philippines, B-29 raids while the war map shrank week by week. Tanaka studied it obsessively, realizing the empire he'd sworn to die for was collapsing. Spirit could not replace factories or stop bombers. Some prisoners still insisted Japan would rise again. Others quietly admitted the war was already lost. On work details that spring, they noticed America's abundance, tractors plowing fields in hours, radios playing in kitchens, children on bicycles, women in bright dresses. A farmer's wife hummed a cheerful tune, and Tanaka, caught tapping his foot, was met with a laugh. Cultural exchanges deepened kabuki shows, baseball games, open political jokes. Then Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender, repatriation loomed, and Yamashita finally said it. "I fear going home." The announcement of repatriation spread through the camp like a shiver through tall grass. Men froze mid-game, paused with half-tied boots, let spoons rest in bowls as the words sank in. The war was over. They were going home. For weeks they had lived in limbo, watching guards relax and newspapers fill with peace treaties instead of battles. For many, home had become mythic, a talisman carried through captivity. Now, with ships ready to take them across the Pacific, home felt distant and frightening. Tanaka sat at his bunk that night, staring at the issued duffel bag. Clothes, toiletries, food. Neat, orderly, American. He thought of the last time he had carried a uniformed bag, setting out with conviction. That boy was gone. Around him, some men spoke with excitement, others with dread, a few admitting they did not want to leave. The final weeks felt surreal. Guards shook hands, posed for photographs, exchanged small gifts. An American sergeant pressed cigarettes into Yamashita's hand. Another gave away his baseball glove. What began as captor and captive ended as something neither side could quite name. In early October 1945, the gates swung open. Trucks lined up. Men climbed aboard, turning to look back at barracks that had once seemed like cages, but now felt almost like home. Tanaka gripped the rail as the camp receded, the baseball diamond, guard towers, the mess hall chimney. For all its contradictions, it had been his safest years. At the port, the waiting ships brought a lump to his throat. The voyage home was rough, but the ships were stocked with American efficiency. Some men laughed at the irony. Others stared in silence. Japan appeared on the horizon as a land of ruins. Families waited thinner, older. Tanaka embraced his fragile mother. But reality soon hardened. Scarce food, scarce work, shame heavy in every conversation. When he tried to describe America, his mother hushed him. Silence was safer. Yet his memories lived on baseball diamonds, coffee, and tin mugs, laughter. Years later, Yamashita wrote, "I still dream of the camp." Tanaka kept the letter hidden. Many former prisoners carried the same quiet truth. Behind barbed wire, they had lost their fear and regained their humanity.